Ancient Rome is truly the cradle of modern civilization. And not the medieval clowns who believed in magic and studied astrology seriously, but Rome itself, medicine, a well-organized army that conquered 3 continents, and a governmental system that allowed them to hold it all together. Everything was born there. Modern countries resemble Rome far more than a laughingstock like the medieval Neapolitan Republic. It's no surprise that the world also borrowed entertainment from there. Even if you don't follow UFC fights, you've likely heard of them. But what would UFC look like in Roman style? Far deadlier, more epic, and on a much larger scale. Today we dive into that very atmosphere and live a day in the shoes of a real, damn, gladiator. Meet Eliseo Faustus, an ordinary mid-ranking gladiator training in Roman barracks, near the Great Colosseum. His name probably surprises you. It's 185 AD, and if you remember our video about legionaries, Roman names were quite specific. That's entirely true. Lucius Aurelius Commodus sits on the throne, and Roman naming traditions were still in full effect. Our gladiator is called Eliseo Faustus because he is a slave, and slaves were usually not given formal names. Interestingly, legally, slaves were considered their owners' children but completely without rights, and names rarely mattered. Sometimes they were called by a nickname like First or Third, or simply Boy or Lad, though often a slave retained the name he had as a free person. Eliseo was enslaved somewhere in Spain, and his owner didn't bother, allowing him to keep his original name. Faustus is a nickname meaning lucky. Such nicknames were rarely given to slaves, usually for some achievement. In Eliseo's case, it was clear he was a good gladiator and had already earned money for his owner, so he earned the nickname Lucky. As you probably guessed, slaves made up the majority of gladiators, though they didn't strongly resist. A gladiator was well-fed, trained, and excused from regular work. And although initially people were taken to the arena by force, later the number of volunteers grew so much that lines were nearly endless. And it wasn't just slaves, criminals and prisoners of war were often sent to be gladiators instead of prison. Sometimes free citizens, often wealthy, also became fighters voluntarily. There was also another thing that modern society inherited from Rome: betting. Before matches, the arenas were covered with posters of the fighters, loud announcements, and offers to place bets on the outcome. Huge amounts of money circulated around the gladiators. For the owner, Eliseo could be almost the most valuable asset, provided, of course, he was a skilled gladiator. Ancient Rome itself borrowed the tradition of combat from its ancestors. The ancient Etruscans performed sacrifices following a similar principle. A group of people was gathered, each given a weapon, and they fought to the death. The one who died was considered a sacrifice, and the survivor was deemed chosen by the gods. The survivor was allowed to live and was even honored. Clever Romans realized people loved this spectacle and gradually turned the fights into profitable festivals in honor of Mars, the god of war. By 105 BC, gladiatorial battles were officially called public spectacles and held with state support. So being a gladiator was considered quite prestigious. Eliseo, in order to gain the position, deliberately started a fight with other slaves. This caught the owner's attention. Eliseo handled his hands well and was sent to a gladiator school. The school itself was a very specific place. Upon admission, Eliseo took a real oath. Its meaning was that a person legally declared himself dead, and the owner could no longer sue for the death of the gladiator. Eliseo also obeyed a strict professional code. First, a gladiator had to remain silent during the fight. On the arena, fighters communicated exclusively through gestures. Second, cowardice was forbidden. A defeated gladiator had to remove his helmet and look at the crowd to show that there was not a trace of fear in his eyes and that he was ready to die. Third, there was a law of honor. Gladiators avoided underhanded moves and, if defeated, offered their throat to the opponent's sword. In the most extreme cases, they even had to take their own life. So what exactly does Eliseo fight for? Obviously, a gladiator's life was short. In 1 week, he could participate in 7 fights. But we must not forget that in ordinary life, an owner could kill a slave out of boredom. Times were harsh, and life was cheap. So Eliseo chose the life of a warrior. After all, he had his personal team, a doctor, a cook, and a trainer. And the owner would kill anyone who dared harm his precious gladiator. Ahead also loomed the rudis, a wooden sword that granted a gladiator freedom. Only a few received it, to maintain the illusion of hope. But they did receive it. Usually, it was due to the wild love of the public or a high-ranking official. Emperors, almost at every fight, personally presented rudis to gladiators to appear merciful and gain the people's favor. The daily routine of a gladiator was as simple as can be. Eliseo lived in a tiny room of just 6 square meters. To strengthen muscles, fighters trained with weapons and armor twice as heavy as battle gear. Early rise, breakfast, exercises with the trainer, and it went on endlessly until the day of the fight arrived. Originally, such days coincided with holidays, imperial coronations, and other memorable events. But by the beginning of our era, gladiatorial games became a festival in themselves. Julius Caesar, back in 65 BC, understood the potential and held massive games with 320 fights. The Romans went wild over the spectacle, and Caesar gained enormous support and votes. The modern equivalent of Roman games is not UFC but rather wrestling. Gladiatorial battles were carefully planned by a specially appointed person called the editor, who supervised everything. Before the fights, theatrical performances and music entertained the crowd in every possible way. Then gladiators who refused to fight were brought out and publicly beaten and punished. Only after that did the real matches begin. Just like today, newcomers went first, and the most exciting battles were saved for last. There were countless types of fights, and people weren't allowed to fight in just anything. Romans had a strict system where each class of fighter had specific equipment. Gladiators known as bestiarii fought animals and were considered the lowest caste. Hoplomachii imitated Greek hoplites, Gauls fought with spears, and Dimachari carried 2 swords. There were about 26 different types of gladiators, all to keep the audience entertained. Crossovers between classes were common, and spectators loved to see a foot soldier trying to kill a mounted fighter. Eliseo was a typical Murmillo gladiator. These fighters wore a helmet featuring a fish called mormir and were the most numerous. They were bare-chested, had minimal equipment, a small shield, and a standard gladius. Murmillos were sent against all opponents, and statistics show they managed quite well even against heavily armed Thracians. Many misconceptions surround the fights themselves. Eliseo was not just cannon fodder, and Roman fights were not chaos. Every battle was observed by a jury called the Summa Rudis, former gladiators who had gained freedom. They noted unfair strikes and techniques, could disqualify a fighter or, conversely, reward him. The expert commission often gave recommendations regarding rudis, and Eliseo knew this well. That's why he, like other skilled gladiators, fought honestly and aimed to win the judge's favor. Here comes the interesting part. As you probably know, the fate of the loser was decided by the audience. If Eliseo failed, he had to remove his helmet and wait for his fate. The ruler decided it based on the crowd's opinion. The public voted using specific gestures, which, unfortunately, were often misinterpreted. A fist with an extended finger always had the same meaning. It didn't matter whether the finger was up or down. For the gladiator, it meant death, the finger symbolized a sword. A downward thumb clearly signified a negative outcome, representing a sword striking the throat from above. To spare a gladiator, a fist with the thumb tucked inside was used, representing a sword sheath. It should be noted that the percentage of pardons was low. Most often, it applied to crowd favorites or promoted gladiators owned by noblemen. Yet, the decision was made by the people. Rulers weren't foolish enough to oppose the will of the common folk. Revolts were common, and executing a beloved gladiator could mean a death sentence for the emperor himself. There are a few more myths about Eliseo Faustus's profession. Movies and books often portray gladiators as invincible bodybuilders. In reality, this wasn't the case. A few months before the season, Eliseo and his colleagues tried to gain weight with fatty food. The reason was obvious: thick skin and fat layers could protect against accidental knife strikes to vulnerable areas. Few gladiators were actual bodybuilders. Protecting internal organs, even with fat, was far more important. Another interesting fact: work. Eliseo, besides being a gladiator, also served as a guard. Owners preferred to move through the city accompanied by their fighters on non-fight days. Sometimes, after proper training, They were freed from deadly fights entirely and left to serve as permanent guards. But even this didn't make a gladiator's life easy. At least 1 in 3 fighters didn't survive the next games. Dissatisfaction often led to revolts, the most famous being Spartacus, who gathered the discontented and fought successfully against the regular Roman army. The problem was that even skilled in combat, gladiators knew little about tactics and strategy. So most revolts were quickly suppressed, and games continued across the empire. Besides the famous Colosseum, other arenas have survived to this day. The Pula Amphitheater in Croatia is considered the best preserved. There's also the Arena of Divo in Verona, the Lutetia Arena, and even the Marc-Antoine Gordiano Amphitheater in Tunisia. The Roman Empire's territory was huge, and people everywhere loved gladiatorial games. Would you like to see such a spectacle? Share your thoughts in the comments and, of course, don't forget to like the video. Though his finger is raised now, in our time, this gesture isn't nearly as harsh.